Fixing two-stroke equipment can be simple, especially when they're quite new or have very little runtime on them. But what happens when you get one that's not new, has a lot of runtime on it, and it's also been worked on before with very questionable results? I know that last part was kind of vague, but it all makes sense when you see the problems it has, the repairs they tried to do to it, and the final results. So in today's video, we're going to be looking at this very orange string trimmer. And the problem is that it won't start, but the problems only get more complicated each and every time we try and fix them. I'll let you know right now that 90% of the time, fixing these is pretty straightforward. But this one is the 10% where things do not go according to plan and the machine fights back each and every way it can. So it does have some fuel in the tank, which is great news. The only thing left to do now is try and start it. So it didn't even try and start, which is not good news. Now there are a couple of reasons why it wouldn't start, one being that the engine might be flooded with too much fuel. But the other possibility is that there's no spark from the ignition system. Now the flooding is going to be really tough to figure out because we can't see inside the engine, but the spark is something we can check using a spark checker. So the checker installs in line with the spark plug, however when going to take the boot off, it unfortunately comes off the wire. So here's the question, did I disconnect the boot from the wire or was it already disconnected when I got it, taken off by a different person? Of course it really doesn't matter, but in the meantime, I'll put it back on without the boot, then try starting it one more time. So after several pulls with no choke and full throttle, the engine tried to start and eventually it ran on its own. Unfortunately, it didn't stay running, so we'll need to look at the rest of the fuel system to find out why. Also, before we tear into the fuel system, the easiest part to check out first would be the fuel inside the fuel tank. We're looking for water sitting at the bottom, or the gasoline might be very old and stale. However, after looking and smelling it, we don't see any water and it smells just like the fuel that you would get at the fuel pump. So the fuel is not the issue, but what we see next is a huge concern. Now what you're looking at is what's left of the fuel filter because the filter part is missing. It should look something like this, but with the white stone part gone, there might as well be no filter at all. And because there's basically no fuel filter, it means we definitely have to inspect the screen inside the carb for a buildup. That brings us to yet another problem that was made by the last person who worked on this trimmer. When taking this carb off, I felt no resistance from the gasket, and that's because it was already broken to begin with. Sometimes the gaskets can get stuck to the carb, and if you're not careful, the gasket will tear apart, which is not good. And as you just saw, part of the gasket was stuck to the backside of the carb, leaving us with this really bad situation. So first off, it means we'll need to replace this rather large gasket. Unfortunately, we'll have to use a different one until I can find my spare. It also means we have more cleaning to do to the carb than our usual. Next, we'll take off the pumping section, that way we can inspect the screen. And as expected, the screen does have some debris on it, which could be causing our running problem. The more you run this engine without a filter, the more the screen will get clogged until eventually the carb won't work anymore. The pumping diaphragm looks great and we should be able to reuse it. Also, don't forget to check it for debris as well. Next, we'll take off this plate covering the metering diaphragm and see if it has any problems with it. So this one is going to be a bit strange. We know it works, however, it does have some problems with it. It is a bit out of shape from a wrinkle that runs across it. It's also not sitting in a neutral position, which means we probably should replace it. Now it is somewhat pliable and soft, and that's probably the only reason why it's still working. Now I am choosing not to do a deep clean on this carb, and that's because we know it still works. But if I had any doubts about its ability to work the way it's supposed to, then I'd probably do a much better job cleaning it. So the only part I'm choosing to replace is the metering diaphragm. So you can buy just these diaphragms without having to buy the entire rebuild kit. Or if you don't even want to bother doing that, then I'd recommend just buying a new aftermarket carb instead. There's nothing wrong with taking the easy way out of a problem, especially if it means you can avoid a major headache as well. So the only thing left to do now is to put the carb back together and then move on to the fuel lines and that very important fuel filter. I'm not sure what kind of fuel line this is, but I'm going to use one that you can see through. That way, when you purge the fuel system, you'll be able to tell when the fuel is moving through it. Now you can choose whatever color fuel line you want, but I like to use this one because it seems to last a long time. So the first line I'll be running will be for the fuel filter. That means it'll need to be long. That way, we can pull the end of the fuel line out of the tank to install the fuel filter on it. These filters are not that expensive, but of course if you buy them in bulk, each one will be very cheap. You don't have to buy a package of 10, but even buying a 3-pack would make good financial sense. This filter requires you to push the fuel line all the way against the metal part. But there are some out there that won't make you do this, so choose which one you want to deal with. Once back in the fuel tank, make sure the filter is near the bottom of the tank. This will help to ensure that it'll be able to pick up all the available fuel when you're using it. Next, we'll go through the spare gaskets I do have to see which one will work for this carb. We want to find the one where all 3 openings line up, otherwise the carb will not work like it should. I know it looks like I'm installing the carb, but instead I'm placing the carb so I can cut the fuel lines to length. But after that, we'll then install the gasket followed by the carb and then at the same time connect the fuel lines too. On this carb, the filter line will connect to the bottom brass port while the return line connects to the port closer to the bulb. If you happen to get them backwards, the engine might still work, but it means the unfiltered line is pulling fuel into the carb, which is not good. After adding fuel to the tank, we'll then do a flow test. So when pressing on the purge bulb, fuel will come up the filter line and into the carb. It'll then fill the bulb and then return back to the fuel tank. And as you can see, it's flowing just like it should be, but if yours is not doing anything, then there might be a problem with the carb or the fuel filter. But if you tried your best and it's still not working, then I'd recommend just buying a new carb instead. The last thing to do is to replace the air filter box and the filter and then try starting it. So it is starting and running for a bit, but it won't stay running. Now this kept happening a couple of times, so the next step is to try and adjust the carb. So the L screw is the one closer to the engine, and it's for low engine speed fuel adjustments and for quick trigger squeezes. While the H screw is the one closer to the airbox, and it's for high engine speed fuel adjustments or while the trigger is fully squeezed. And finally, the screw above them both is the idle set screw. Unfortunately, you'll need a special tool to be able to turn the fuel adjustment screws, but you can find these online as a kit. Now because the engine won't stay running, we'll need to make adjustments to the L screw. And to start off, I'll turn the screw counterclockwise a quarter turn to give the engine more fuel. So it looks like adding a bit of extra fuel really helped out. Now the idle set screw will need attention, but that's something we'll do once we try another cold start, which this was not. So here's the problem. A single tuning session is not enough. You're going to need to keep doing this multiple times to get it right and then ensure that it keeps working. Now as for this one, I'll replace that gasket when I find the right one and see if it makes any difference in the tuning. But as for right now, it's going to need several cold starts before we even consider giving it back to the consumer. So I never discourage consumers from doing their own repairs, but sometimes it's just something else for me to fix. So my question is, would you even attempt to fix your own stuff, or once you realized how tough it was going to be, just end up giving it to someone else to repair? Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions about this project or about your own projects, and I hope to see you in the next video.